Okay, so thanks everybody for attending tonight. We have 5 presentations, and the first one is Matthew Serenita. So Matthew, whenever you want to go ahead and start sharing, you can start.
Okay, can everyone see it?
Yes.
Okay. Good evening. My name is Matthew Serenita. My capstone project for the semester is using high resolution imagery to inspect signs of encroachment in national forests. My advisor for my capstone is Karen Schuckman. So encroachment can be viewed as where development is impeding or removing forest boundaries. And this can be seen in development and land use change. And the reason national forests are important to kind of study and look at is because they don't have as much protection as we think they do. A lot of their lands are used for sustainability use, and they don't have as much protection as, say, a national park or especially conservation areas. Now, determining where the development takes place in and around these forests can be determined through the wildland-urban interface. Oops. And it's really just the area where housing meets dense forests and wildland vegetation. Now, the definition actually changes depending on who's researching it and where the study area is actually. A general consensus in previous studies have shown that it's the area where housing and residential areas intermix or interface with dense vegetation. I do like this definition, but I feel as if the USDA Forest Service has a better definition. It does bring into account the homes in direct contact with dense forests, but it also brings into the discussion of the loss of native species, the introduction of non-native invasive species, as well as forest fragmentation and loss of boundaries. And as I stated, the WI is very good for identifying where high development is occurring. And the reason why is due to the wildfire risk. Now, interestingly, a lot of the wildland-urban interface is actually in the eastern side of the United States. And that was initially surprising to me, given as we see so much wildfire activity in the West, especially in California, Seattle, Colorado. And we know through past studies that there's a high correlation between the two. In fact, majority of the wildfires that do occur are directly caused by human interaction. Now, these interactions could be anywhere as small as someone dropping a lit cigarette on a dry patch of grassland, or even people not putting out their campfires all the way and, still having that sparks or those ignitions. And these can ignite wildland fuels and all these dense forests, and it makes it really hard for fire management policy, city planners, and local governments to kind of combat these wildfires. Now here I just have 2 quick image examples. Both of them are in California. The one on the right is actually just outside San Diego. And these are just some of the intense wildfires that can occur in these areas. And actually all of the homes on the right-hand image are pretty much about to be engulfed in this wildfire. And these wildland-urban interface and these wildfire trends aren't just a sole phenomenon to the United States. This is actually occurring all over the world, and especially in Mediterranean areas, such as places along the coast of Spain, near Catalonia, places around islands in Italy, even Northern Africa. But in Europe, they're populated by secondary homes. And of course, these homes aren't going to be in large cities or towns. So they're going to be more towards dense forests. In Canada, there's a phenomenon called urban fringe, where communities of about 1,000 or more are popping up, and it's leading Canada to become more and more urbanized. And with the development and with, vegetation loss, we also should take into account of agriculture. In fact, in Egypt, there was about 26,000 acres of agriculture loss just simply due to development. And then bringing it back to the US, in the 2 decades between 1990 and 2010, the wildland-urban interface grew by about 33%. Now, during this time, this was the fastest growing land use. which is why it's important to study how it's been growing and try to predict its future trends. Because development also brings in additional land uses and trails, recreations that can fragment native species, fragment forest boundaries, and push, natural habitats back further. And this has been studied further in the past with census data. And census data is good, but it uses block data, which I felt generalized a lot of the results that past researchers have found. A lot of their results came through buffered around their AOIs. And those buffers could include either anywhere between 5 kilometers, 10 kilometers, up to 100 kilometers just around the AOI to try and show development and high development. And then other researchers have used an adaptation to the dynamic time warping, called the time-weighted dynamic time warping. Now, this was a piece of an inspiration for my project, simply because they used Landsat data and they looked at a time series analysis. And that's what kind of got me into using that for this project. And furthermore, they also studied national forests with their work. And the 2 forests that I'm going to be looking at are located in eastern Texas. Now, these do have some protected areas inside, and there are some cities and small towns in and around the boundaries of these national forests. And the great thing about these 2 is that they're about 20 to 50 miles apart from border to border and from center to center. So we're really hoping to see some drastic changes between the 2 and potentially discover a reason as to why one has more than the other. And the first one I'll be looking at is the Davy Crockett National Forest. Now, as stated before, there are some conservation areas and management areas within. And to give you a rough estimate of actually where in eastern Texas this is, it's about 80 to 100 miles away from Houston. Now, what's interesting to see on the map is that there is a lot of forest fragmentation throughout, and there's a bunch of recreation areas, horse trails, camps, and you name it, all throughout the forest boundary. And the second national forest is the Angelina National Forest. Now, the difference between the other one is this has the large Sam Rayburn Reservoir that naturally cuts in between the 2 sides of the forest. And once again, there are a bunch of forest fragmentation happening and potentially pushbacks as we can see in the map. And it's important to note that there are 2 sort of forest exclaves that are in the northwest of the map. I'm not going to be particularly interested in these, and that's simply because they consist of mostly wetlands, lakes, streams, and rivers, which isn't exactly conducive to development naturally. Now, as stated, the protected areas, there's the Big Slough in the north of the Davy Crockett and the Upland Island and the Turkey Hill on both sides of the reservoir for the Angelina National Forest. Now, this data has been taken from the Protected Areas database, which is available through the USGS. And so the goal and objective is to identify encroachment and to use methods and tools developed through here to help in protecting wilderness, developing new methods or building up on past methods, and then hopefully predicting future trends in the area. And to do this, I'll be working with change detection and using 2 different normalized difference indices, as well as a normalized burn ratio. Now, those will be used in conjunction and sort of support the meat of the project, which is the time series analysis. And all of this sort of data and methods are going to be done through ArcGIS Online and ArcPro. Now, ArcGIS and Online and Pro both have ArcImage, which Esri hosts a bunch of Landsat imagery, Sentinel data, worldview data, but they also have National Land Cover data set. And this is just going to help with a faster change detection and image processing, but it'll also help to transfer the data and the files between the software. Let's just say if Arc Online can't, for some reason, complete a certain change detection or a certain method, I know that I can easily swap between the two services. Excuse me. And the hosted Landsat imagery is going to be directly through ARC Online. There is Landsat 8 and 9 available, and available through a layer called multispectral Landsat, which does go all the way back to 1990. But if I wanted individual images in particular, I would have to go through USGS, which isn't that much of a pain or a hassle to go through. Now, there is very slight differences between the bands of Landsat 7 and Landsat 8. And Landsat 8 comes with coastal and cirrus bands, but they won't really be needed. And it's really going to be the red bands, the near infrared, and the shortwave infrared bands for both satellites. And one image covers both of the AOIs, which is great if I'm going to need to actually download all of the images separately. And this will just help so that I don't have to mosaic or splice a whole bunch of imagery together to perform the change detection. The other data, as I mentioned, was the National Land Cover data set. Now, this is a great tool as a reference of what's actually going on the ground. Through satellite imagery, we can see dense forests and we can see open lands and water, but we really don't know what's going on the ground level. So areas that might look like open land could actually be agriculture. And so this will just be another way to kind of understand what's happening. And again, this is available through Living Atlas and ARC Online. And we do have dates all the way back to 2001. So we do have a lot of time and dates to look at. And as I've stated, one of the first of my difference indices is NDVI, which is built into ArcGIS Online. As we can see on the far right, this actually comes from the classic map viewer in ARC Online, and there is a tab solely dedicated to monitoring vegetation. There's also Landsat 8 and 9 imagery that has raw NDVI and colorized NDVI. So these should be helpful with comparing the time series analysis. And NDVI is great because it'll highlight and display specific vegetation over the years and really pick that out and in comparison to development. And to understand where development actually is occurring, I'll be using the built-up index. Now, while the NDVI looked at vegetation, this is going to clearly display and highlight the built-up areas and development that's taken place over the years. Now, unfortunately, unlike the NDVI maps, there is no availability for NDVI in ARC Online. They only have Sentinel-2 data, which isn't really going to be helpful for looking at Landsat data. So the only thing to do for this is to just kind of compare the bands, do band combinations, and see what I get from those combinations. And lastly, I have the normalized burn ratio. Now, normally, burn ratios are used for after fires and showing fire scars. And this will be helpful in just identifying, if a wildfire occurred in the area in a certain year and, if development had taken place over there instead. Now, wildfires won't be particularly noticed or looked at in this project, simply because it's a whole nother section and a lot more data to look at. But it's important to just understand where that's occurring and if that affects development. Now, the time series analysis, as I said, is the meat of the project, and it's built into both ARC Online and ARC Pro through Change Detection Wizard, and it'll model a pixel's history using tens or hundreds of images over the years. Now, there's 2 to 3 different ways to go about running a time series analysis. There's a continuous change detection and classification, CCDC. There's Landtrender, and there's a combination of both that uses little bits of methods from each change detection. And there's similarities and differences between the two, albeit some are minor and some are major. They both use Landsat imagery, which is great for this project, but CCDC uses regression models while Landtrender uses segmentation and tracks a pixel's trajectory over a set a time. For CCDC, we need a lot more data. It takes into account all seasons. So if I start with an image from October and then I have an image 2 years later from April, this tool will actually take into consideration those changes. While for Landtrender, if I choose something in May, I'm going to need something between April, May, and June, and I can't use December because it won't really track the pixels all too well. And furthermore, we can't really change the output of CCDC. There's no way to change the results or filter out the magnitude of change, which is actually available through Landtrender. And that's really just one of the reasons and the main reason why I'm actually going with Landtrender. And on top of the filtering out the magnitude of change, there's also the disturbance and recovery that it tracks. Now, in the bottom left, we see just a quick example of a graph of a forest. And as the graph dips down and has a logging event, we notice that it's disturbance. And as the graph starts to trend upwards, we start going into a recovery period for it. Now, this can visually be seen on the right-hand side map as the blue and red pixels. As the pixels in the area turn red, it's the disturbance. It's the event that's occurring that Landtrender is pointing out. And as the red pixels turn to a dark orange, to a bright yellow, and then back to a lighter shade of blue, albeit not blue as it was before, this is the recovery. Now, fortunately for this, I'm not going to be too interested in the recovery section of Landtrender. And that's really because if development occurs on an area where 20 trees were planted, well, those 20 trees aren't going to be replanted if there's a house or there's a shopping complex or roads built on top of it. So it's really going to be the disturbance section of Landtrender that's going to be the most important for this project. And the anticipated results is just trying to identify where future development trends are happening, where encroachment is occurring, and if it's occurring closer to these protected areas or if they're not, and understanding what the trend is. And on top of that is the Davy Crockett National Forest experiencing more development than the Angelina, and is that happening more towards their protected areas? And I guess really boiling down to it, there's some practical uses to it. If in the future we wanted to tweak designs and tweak methods, we can aid in future development for sustainability, helping city planners and forest management kind of map out where they want to build and what they want to look at. And this could also have application for other countries. There's lots of illegal logging and development in places all around the world. And hopefully, if someone wanted to tweak methods and tweak designs, they could use the same tools that I've used to hopefully use that for them. And with all of this information all said and done, I plan to have the results and the analytics complete by the spring of 2023. And with all of those being completed, I plan to present this at the American Society for Photogrammetry and Remote Sensing conference somewhere around the summer of 2023. And here is just a list of the references that I've used for the statistics and facts in this presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Matt. Very good presentation. In case anybody came in a little bit after we started, feel free to unmute and ask your question out loud, or if you want to go ahead and type a question in the chat, that's fine too.
Hey, Matt, it's Corey. I got a question on, you say that a lot of these people are building and like encroaching in the forest. Having worked in like city planning before, like how are they getting their building plans approved to build on land that they shouldn't be building on? Because that seems like that would be a problem too.
Yeah, so the national forests, there's a whole list on the protected areas database of where people can and can't build, and really just want to see where the actual building is taking place and how close they're coming to the actually protected areas. because the closer they get, they expand the wildland urban interface, and it does kind of have a cascading effect of health issues down the road for, just the environment, but also for potentials of wildfires.
Just while, in case anybody's typing right now, Matt, are there kind of tagging on to Corey's question? Are those rules different in different states about where you can build and what kind of buffer, or is that always the same?
From what I've seen in certain states, there are, especially further out west, there's more guidelines of, where you can build, how close to specific areas. And I feel like as we hear more and more about, wildfires over the years, people are hopefully learning, but it seems as if people are just kind of expanding and kind of building wherever they see open land. And a lot of times it is actually coming close to these dense forests and potentially closer to these protected areas.
Any other questions? Okay, well, in case anybody does have a follow-up question for you, Matthew, if you could just stick your email address in the chat, that'd be great.
Yep, I'll do that right now. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for a great presentation. Looking forward to hearing how it turns out. Okay, so next up is Corey. So Corey, if you want to go ahead and start sharing, you can start when you're ready.
All right, let me click here, share my screen. Go. Right. Okay. Good evening, everybody. My name is Corey Gehring, and my presentation is going to be on a review of the City of South Bend's fire services.
Are you sharing it yet, Corey? I'm not.
Yeah, I clicked share. Is it not showing up?
Not yet. I wonder if it's on a different screen. Do you have two monitors?
I do, and I thought I told it to share on the right one.
I saw it earlier, but I'm not seeing it now.
Hang on, let me see what's going on here. Share screen. Share screen one.
Looks like it's coming up now. There we go.
Is that better? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
I think I forgot to hit the actual share button. Okay, back to where we were. Okay, next slide here. So the fire services of any city, or pretty much anywhere you live, is a pretty crucial part of infrastructure. They actually serve a purpose. Your tax money goes to fund the fire trucks and the fire stations and the other assets there. So it's a very important part of your city's infrastructure. I found out as I was doing some of the research into my project that there hasn't been a review of South Bend's fire services in over 20 years. So that definitely shows that there's a need for it. And I went and sat in on a city planning meeting and talked with the fire chiefs, and nobody's ever done a geospatial analysis of their assets. So this will be kind of new, and I have some good feedback coming from the actual firefighters, which is good. So what I'm going to do is I plan to do a geospatial analysis of where all of their assets are and see if they are meeting the needs of the population. So speaking of population of South Bend's about 103,000 people, and the city covers 42 plus square miles, and there's only 11 fire stations in the city. And each one is manned 24/7, so that's good. In some other parts of the country, you may have volunteers where your fire station is only manned by one person, and that guy just answers the phones, and then the rest get a call. So again, 20 years is a long time to go without any kind of review of where your assets are and what's going on. So I definitely want to kind of meet that gap and fulfill that for them. the thing when you call 911. So if you call 911 on your cell phone, there's a E911, which geolocates your cell phone. And as soon as the call goes out, it dispatches to the nearest fire station that has the assets to come and respond to your calls, whether it's a fire or heart attack or whatever. And then the same system has been around a little bit longer for 911. So if you call, the 911 dispatch gets it. After taking the ethics class that I had to take, I realized that these 911 calls are actually going to show up on my maps as people's addresses. So to kind of do that, I'm going to blur and use like heat maps or chloroplast. So you can see the amount. There'll be a way to distinguish the amount of calls that are in an area, but it's not going to single out people's houses or anybody individual. It's going to cluster all the calls together. So for my study, you ask, well, what are these assets that you're talking about? Well, for fire assets, there's actually 9 different types of fire trucks, but the city of South Bend only uses 4. So I'm not going to go into all of them and the details of what they do. But right now, the city has 4 turntable ladder trucks, which they call trucks. They have the regular pumper trucks is 11, so 1 for each station, and they call those engines. And then they have 1 heavy rescue vehicle. And what that is it's a vehicle that has like the jaws of life and all the different things they need to like do heavy lifting or bending or breaking of things. And then it also has a mini trauma unit in it too to kind of be used in situations where there's trauma. Because South Bend is situated on the St. Joseph River, they actually have 2 rescue boats that are located at the firehouses closest to the water. So I would be tracking those. And then the stations themselves. So right now, like I said, there's 11 districts and there's 11 stations. The city does know that they need a 12th. They're planning on putting one on the northwest side, but the lot is just something that the city owes. So part of my study is also going to be there's a tool on Fire Cares, which is a firehouse locator, and you can put in your criteria, and it kind of spits out where a good lot would be to put your fire station. I'm going to do my own independent data and see where my data says a firehouse should be and compare it to that Fire Cares one. And then obviously the city already is kind of thinking about a lot that they own. So there may not be any say in where it goes anyway, because the city's going to build it where they're going to build it. Some things to consider. There may be a need to relocate some assets. I don't know how financially that works. I know I talked with my advisor about that, and sometimes that's a money issue. Like certain people have paid for this fire truck to be at this station, so they're not going to move it somewhere else. But I know just in my initial investigations, I can see that there's like a lot of overlap in the downtown areas. And then there's a bunch of gaps as you get out into the urban sprawl areas of the city. I also think that as I go through again, I'm going to try to locate the best place where they should build a new fire station, because I believe that my data was going to identify that they do need one. And I want to see if there's going to be any other significant overlaps, again, like in the city where they may have just too many people or too many firehouses in one place. So the goal is to do a comprehensive geospatial review and get them a picture of where everything is, because it's a lot easier to understand the problem if you can visualize it. People can come to meetings and tell you they need something, but when you can actually visualize, like, okay, this is why we need that, I think that's going to be helpful. So one of the objectives is evaluating the data. Perot and Stutz did a urban planning for fire stations. It's kind of way back in 1991, but it's a very interesting study, because when I asked the South Bend Fire Department, like, how do you place your fire stations? Like, is there any criteria? And you're like, no, we just put them where the city says to put them. So I'm like, okay, this, the Perot and Stutz has 6 different criteria that they used in the city of San Diego to build a fire station. So I'm going to try to do the data planning the way that they did, just because it made sense and it gives you kind of a criteria to go off of. The second objective is to display their national fire incident reporting, or NFIRS. There is a database that they keep at the state and national levels that track every call that comes in for 911 and what they were dispatched for. And it shows their the time the call went in, the turnout time, which is the time that it takes the firemen to get dressed and get on the truck. And then, the garage door goes up and they say their wheels on the ground. So like once they start moving, and then there's another time is their response time from the fire station when they say, hey, our wheels are rolling, until they actually get to the fire or the accident. And then there's a combination of the two. That's just the call out time. And that's what I'm going to be using for my heat maps, is tracking that information to see, like, is a fire station maybe overextended because they're making calls that are too far away, or is it normal? Another objective is to give this data to the city, and because the fire districts are pretty large, I'm going to have 11 different maps broke down for them, as well as one main map. But I'm going to break down each one of the fire districts for them, so they can see that a little bit more clear. So my methodology, qualitative information is going to come from the National Fire Protection Association standards. The NFPA standard it's a standard, but it's not a law. But I do know that the city of South Bend follows that standard. So that'll help kind of have a measuring stick, if you would, for seeing how they handle their alarms. So it tracks 3 different parts. Again, it's the alarm handling is when the call comes into 911 and it gets dispatched to the station, from the guys getting the call to getting on the trucks and the wheels rolling to actually showing up on the site and dealing with the problem. The fire cares data, they're an independent contractor that is based out of Washington, DC, and they track all of the fire station information. They have some really good tools. I've asked to get access to that data because it's proprietary. And they said they do that. I'm just waiting for the fire chief to approve that I can see it. But anyway, they really have a good tool in there that I want to use, again, to compare what does my data say? Where do I think a fire station should be with what information I have? And what does their tool say the fire station should be? So the map on the right is just kind of a breakdown of where the different fire districts are right now. You can see some are larger than others. The urban sprawl to the north, there's a lot more buildings out there in the District 11 around the airport. So in my opinion, what I think the results are going to show that they need a fire station up there. So one of the overlays I'm going to build and on top of the fire district is just to show where the different assets are. And it's probably kind of hard to see on there, but like I'm going to do blowouts of like, what's the equipment at that station? Is it an engine station? Is it a ladder station? Is it a pumper station? What assets do they have there? Mainly that's just a tool so that, people who are not in the fire services can look and say, okay, that's what's in that place. Having a location of all the current stations, I can also do like route. Esri has a route tool where you can kind of highlight something and see how long it takes to get from point A to point B. And that'd be something that I could use just to assess the districts, to make sure that, makes sense. And then any identifiable gaps, again, I'm thinking there's going to be mainly a gap way up in that the northwest side, because as you can see, there's nothing up there. So my methodology, going to be comparing the findings that I come up with to the fire cares tool. And I want to see, am I close? Am I in the right ballpark when I make a map and show it to them and say, I believe the fire station should be here. And the fire care says it should be here. And then obviously the city will have where they already either intend to build or going to build a station. My timeline, my 596B is in the second part of next year. So I plan to start working on my project in January. In February, I'll be just sorting out all the data and creating my maps, building up my presentation, get my paper written. Hopefully I graduate in April, because the last day of class in April, I believe, is the 17th. And then there are some conferences that are in April, May timeframe that I'm going to try to present at. So you have Esri Conference Southeast, which is in April. It's in Georgia, so that's not too far of a drive for me. I mean, 8 hours, so it's still, I can drive down to Georgia. That would be beneficial because of the financing that I'm on for my degree. I have to get my degree as soon as I possibly can. I'm not supposed to drag my feet on it. They have not published an abstract due date for that conference yet. So I have email reminders set up for whenever they do post that. Then there's also the International Symposium of Web and Wireless Geographic Information. That's in June and it's in Quebec, Canada. I've never been to Canada, but I think that'd be, my wife wants me to do that one just because she wants to go to Canada. But I could also try to present there because the data, the way I'm going to have it packaged is so that you could use it as a web app or a mobile app. And that way it would be a good venue to do that at. And the submissions for that are due January 15th. My presentation's value, the city of South Bend, city planners, I think it would have some value to them. The leadership of the fire departments probably would be interested in seeing, where are all their assets and how are they laid out. And then other municipalities. I know there's a city down to the west of us, Valparaiso, that use the fire cares information, and they have a person whose sole job is to do GIS work for the fire department. So I think this would have some value in being able to show the South Bend Fire Department how good an asset having GIS management of their stuff would be. So my anticipated results anticipate that the data is going to show that, well, obviously where all the current assets are. I'm going to show any gaps or overlaps that need to be addressed. That way the city can make a choice if they needed to move things around. Also, is one of your fire stations being overworked or underutilized? They have one that's called the Island because it never gets any business. So I don't know, but the data is going to definitely show a need for a new firehouse. So that's kind of the main thing. I want to be able to make sure that they understand where the best place for that fireplace or fire station would be. And then I have 2 slides worth of references for the different informations that I used for the presentation and the data that I'm going to use for my project. And any questions?
Great. It looks like you already have a question from Cindy. I'm not sure if you can see the chat.
Let me minimize this and bring up the Zoom. Oh, that's weird. I can't see where.
Yeah, you might need to stop sharing.
Yeah, let me turn this off. Stop sharing.
There's a way to do it without stopping,
go.
but it's complicated.
Okay, Cynthia says, will you be using network analyst tools in ArcGIS Pro or find the nearest analyst tools in AGOL? I'm going to be using the ArcGIS Pro. And These are great tools to determine the distance and time between 2 points. I probably should have been more clear on that, that I do plan to use the tools in Arc Pro.
I have a quick comment while other people are typing, hopefully. I just happened to Google to see if there are any like sort of fire specific conferences. And there happens to be, I don't, maybe you and David already discussed this one, but there happens to be the Fire Department Instructors Conference in April of 2023 in Indianapolis.
Ooh,
Which I thought was interesting.
that is
So
very
a
interesting.
2.5-hour drive with the perfect time frame because the graduation is early May. So you and David can discuss that one. But I just thought sometimes it's nice to present at something that, you know, where this would benefit other people, you know, other fire departments or whatever. So just a thought.
No, Beth, we did not uncover this.
We did not, but that's a lot shorter drive.
Google is a wonderful thing. I just, you know, every once in a while I'm like, oh, well, you know, maybe it's not a GIS conference. And so this one just happened. Wow, but that was pretty perfect.
Those are sometimes the best audience to speak to, or not the GIS,
Exactly.
because it's a topic-based thing. Corey, I just want you to clarify something to everyone else. I think you cover this more in the paper, but you say this a couple times that the city already knows that they need another fire station. What's the metric, or what's the need or performance that the city knows that they already need another fire department or fire station?
Right, and that's the problem. They know they need one because they just know that like District 11 is huge and they want to put another one on the northwest side. There's been a lot of projects out there, so there's new homes, there's a lot of new development out there.
And
that's the only criteria they have for it. There's no like, hey, we know that there's 1,000 people out here now, and for every 1,000 people, we need a fire station. They don't have anything like that. It's just.
I thought you uncovered a 911 response time, and they're going to be non-compliant in that area.
Yes, but I didn't do the run times yet. No, I'm trying to get access to that data. I was inferring that I believe that that's the problem, because remember we were talking about there's no direct routes up there. You either have to get on the toll road to go to that area, or you have to get on the bypass. Otherwise, you're driving on side streets.
I think that's a very interesting point, though, that you don't want to forget that you already looked at. That's why they have that need, is a 911 response time compliance.
Right.
I think you have 2 more questions in the chat there.
Let's see, we have Tim. Will you include response situations for neighboring municipalities to compare the area of response, or are they far enough away that they don't overlap? We did talk about that. Me and my advisor did cover that. I think I'm gonna have enough data with just doing South Bend that I'm just gonna focus on South Bend, because there are other fire stations that do overlap, like Mishawaka is the city to the east. And if, you know, South Bend's overwhelmed and can't do it, then the Mishawaka fire will come in. I'm going to have to probably do something to delineate that when there is overlap. But on like the west side is very rural as you get out in the Ardmore area and all that. So there's less overlap. Those are all volunteer firefighter houses. Oh, thank you, Beth.
To follow up on my own question, you mentioned that the airport is on the northwest side of South Bend. Does the airport fire station ever respond to residential areas, or is that just on reserve for the airport?
You know, I will have to look that up for you, Tim, because I don't know. I know that the apparatuses that they have there are only for airport fires. Like, you know, the big snorkel truck that has the foam thing on it and stuff, that most of their things are all geared towards aircraft fire. But they do have an ambulance. So that's a good question, because I do not have the answer to that. Write that down. I'll email. Is your email in here? I'll email you.
Yeah, I'll send it to you.
Cool.
It was just a curiosity. I'm not trying to stump you or anything.
No, that's, you know, it's the same thing. Notre Dame has their own fire department too. So like, and so does IUSB, which is downtown. Like they all have their own tiny little fire department. But I know Notre Dame's only responds on Notre Dame campus in St. Mary's. They don't go off at all, but the airport one, I didn't look into. Okay, and next is Mary asked, would you consider surveying the firefighters for their thoughts on the placement? You know, I did think about doing that. Thanks, Tim. I thought about asking, you know, to get some feedback on that. You start to kind of get into like political things when you start talking for people for the, so it'd be, I don't know. I don't know if I want to do that, but that is that's a good idea to see, hey, where are the firefighters? Because they work, they know where they probably need things done at.
I think your advisor will also say, do that after you graduate, because
Yeah.
that involves like the human research protection.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I don't want to rock any waves around here. So.
Okay, does anybody else have any other questions? Lots of good questions there. But thanks, Corey. If you want to go ahead and put your email address in case anybody has some follow-up questions. But great job. And that would be, I hope they are still accepting presentation abstracts. I'm assuming they are.
That was something I was going to ask about a poster board. Could I do a poster board at a conference?
Yes, yeah. So
Okay.
basically, we want you to be able to answer questions, and that would involve, yes, you standing there sometimes for a lot longer than you, or quite a bit longer than you would for an actual presentation. So yes, we have, that is an acceptable.
Okay, good to go. All right,
Okay,
thank you.
so next up is Nicholas Lindberg. So Nick, whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and start sharing. And we don't hear you yet if you're talking.
Sorry, two separate mute buttons. Hold on, let me reshare.
Great.
All right, can everyone see?
Yes.
Okay.
You probably want to put it in slideshow mode.
Yes. All right, so good evening, everyone. My name is Nicholas Lindberg, and my intended project is for Mekong River salinity, monitoring saltwater intrusion using satellite imagery. So as a brief overview for this presentation, I'll be going over just introducing the question that I formed as part of this project proposal process, sharing a bit about the context for the area and situation, highlighting two monitoring organizations that might be served by utilizing this type of methodology and tool, going into my intended data, intended software, my planned methodology, touching on the limitations that I've conceived so far in terms of restricting what data I can reliably use, and my intended deliverables. And I guess we'll get into a Q&A at the end. So the question I ended up forming was, can satellite imagery analysis be applied as a viable tool to monitor saltwater intrusion in the Mekong Delta? My background is in Asian studies. It's focusing on governments, cultural activities and attributes, ethnic policies, and environmental management and how they intersect. So I wanted to have a project that took me back to looking at something in Asia while applying a GIS analysis to it. So that leads me back to the Mekong River. For those who don't know, the Mekong River is a major transnational river that starts in China's Tibetan Plateau and exits through Vietnam after traveling through mainland Southeast Asia. Saltwater intrusion in the Delta and proceeding farther up the rivers is a concern. There are two main factors cited for this. One is gradual sea level rise due to climate change, and coupled with lower river water levels, arguably attributed to damming in the upper river, though that can be contentious for some countries involved. And as saltwater progresses farther upriver, that can threaten vegetative ecosystems, fisheries, and can affect the water table quality for agricultural purposes. For Vietnam in particular, it produces about recently 40 million tons of rice, about 24 million of which come out of the Mekong Delta. So more than half of its rice production occurs in the Mekong Delta. And because rice cultivation is very water intensive, increases in saltwater salinity getting piped through the irrigation can have a negative impact on rice production over time. So I want to look at for using satellite imagery analysis to monitor surface water salinity in the riparian system there. So touching on the two main monitoring entities, they are the Mekong River Commission, or the MRC. This is an intergovernmental body, and it doesn't have any governing power, but it is an intergovernmental organization between Vietnam, Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia. And they share information, they share monitoring data, and they provide policy advice on how to manage the river resources, since it affects all of them. And then specifically, because the Delta is in Vietnam, Vietnam is another entity that would be a good target for entering into this type of monitoring process, especially because of its agricultural dependence in the region. Although I'll note that the Vietnamese government is trying to decrease rice production in the area and try to diversify its types of crops there. So moving on to my data, I'm planning on doing Landsat 7 and 8, specifically relying on the TOA surface reflectance. I'm sure everyone's seen this graphic on the right. I'm sure it'll pop up in other presentations as well, just with the sensor data. In particular for me, in what I'm going to be looking at, the shortwave infrared, the near infrared, and the red band are going to be of importance for me. I want to do a long time frame, which is why I'm using Landsat 7 and Landsat 8. But because they're at 30 meters for resolution, I plan to, if I see a consistent increase in salinity in river sections that have smaller tributaries, then I will want to use Sentinel-2 to just get down to a 20-meter resolution, not as a comparison point with Landsat, but just as an exploratory to look at how far upriver that change is occurring. But again, that's predicated upon looking at the Landsat images. Is there a consistent increase in salinity? Is there a smaller offshooting branch that I can get a better look at confidently with Sentinel-2? So the Landsat footprint that I will mainly be using is, thankfully, just one covers the majority of the Delta. Though I will be adding on in further directions to just see how far I can go confidently with the river there. It is fairly wide, So the 30-meter resolution should let me proceed farther inland. Oh, I suppose I'll just point out, if you look on the left-hand side, you should be able to make out agricultural plains just outside of the footprint there. So it is very heavily agricultural land there. For water quality data, as a comparison point, I'll be using water quality data collected by the Mekong River Commission. They have 43 stations along the main river tributaries, and they've been collecting data from all of the member countries since 1993. They have, I believe, 48 different water quality metrics, and the data is free per request. So I have a lot of requests to get through because I want to look essentially over a 20-year span. I do have, so from 2000 to 2020, I do have 2022 tagged on the end, simply because the data for that will be available when I actually start this. So that might just be a little bit more to just add in. So it's as recent as I can get it. You can see on the right, Landsat 7 will be used from 2000 to 2013. And then I'll be using the Landsat 8 from 2014 onward. You might be a little confused as to why I have 2000, 2001, 2006, 2007 for the years. This is because Vietnam has a dry, wet season cycle, and the dry season is typically between October and March. So it'll cross over between the years. To try getting the most consistency, I'm going to be using scenes from November, December, and January. So that way it's more solidly in the middle of the dry season to hopefully cut down on weather variability. For my software and portals I intend to use, Google Earth Editor for collating, preparing, and analyzing the satellite images. I'm actually not very familiar with the Google Earth Editor, but after talking with another professor, I do believe this is probably the best software I can use for what I want to do. Part of that is because it will cut down on my downloading time, which is a big draw for me because I've had issues with downloading Landsat from either Earth Explorer or Glovis. So being able to process the imagery in Google Earth Editor and then being able to export something closer to a finished product will save me a lot of time, and I won't need to worry about stitching together different scenes as a mosaic. I will still be using ArcGIS Pro, taking products from Google Earth Editor into Pro for editing, error analysis, and just final product creation. And finally, I hope to use Esri Story Map for a final compilation of all my materials, because it'll be online, easily accessible, and can include interactive maps, or as I've recently learned going through the Google Earth Editor tutorials, that I can make an animated GIF, which might be interesting to include to look at a time series change. For methodology, there are two metrics I'm going to look at. One is surface water salinity, and the other is vegetative health. From the resources I've read so far, surface water salinity is something that can be measured for both surface water as well as surface soil. And the typical method that is used is a calculation of the shortwave infrared bands. Typically, a subtract of the sum of the difference between shortwave 2 and shortwave 1 divided by the sum of both. And that seems to be widely used for different salinity checks. For vegetative health is just going on with an NDVI. Surface water salinity is clearly just measuring the salinity itself. The vegetative health is a contextual metric in terms of as salinity progresses into intrudes into freshwater systems, forgot the word, the vegetation that is not accustomed to higher levels of salinity will suffer degradation. So that is a metric that I do want to look at to see how much of a change in vegetative health relates to the increase in salinity. So in Google Earth Editor, starting off with, since I had to learn about this one recently, is I'll need to harmonize the Landsat 7 and 8 bands so that the band frequencies align more properly between their different sensors. I will collate scenes for dry seasons of the selected years and perform a calculation so I can create an average value that I can associate with that year, trying to cut down on weather inconsistencies. And then calculate a salinity index with the difference of the shortwave infrared frequencies, generate NDVI values from the yearly dry season maps, and then create change over time analysis. And then in Arc Pro to do any editing that I think needs to be done from the Google Earth Editor products, and to perform an error assessment using the water quality data that I get from the MRC, and to just create any final exports. Part of that, touching back on social context, is that in the past, when I have had the ability to choose a course project at Penn State, and I've tried going back to doing something in Asia, the Esri catalog has been a bit sparse in that area. So part of what I want to do is to have some available maps at the end that can be, or layers at the end that can be uploaded for the Esri catalog, so that other people that want to do work in this area are able to just pull them up and see them. So such things as just even something basic as a MRC member country map is not in Esri right now, but that's something that could just be easily made and then shared with everyone. So touching on the limitations, I've mentioned a few already, but seasonal storms, there's the wet, dry season. During the wet season, the storms cause a lot of cloud cover, resulting in inconsistent access to satellite imagery for areas. And the flooding causes the river expansion, but is also mostly freshwater flooding. So that will drastically reduce what might be considered a base level of salinity in the river. Something I noted from a study by Kaplan and White, who were looking at utilizing an enhanced vegetative index or vegetation index for an estuary in Louisiana, was they determined that measurable increases in surface salt water were evident before actual vegetative degradation. And they also noted that this degradation is more prominent in ecosystems that are freshwater in nature. As you're more in the mouth of the deltas or the river, that type of vegetation has a higher tolerance for salinity and so does not experience the same level of degradation as farther up the river. So in something I'm expecting to see, I'm not expecting to see a lot of vegetative change closer to the mouth of the delta. But as I get farther upriver, I'm expecting to see greater decline in vegetation. There has been lower levels, lower water levels in the river due to drought, hotter seasons, and just damming. But for the areas I intend to look at, I don't believe any of those sections have ever been running dry because they're more of the main body of the river. So that shouldn't be a factor. But if I want to start exploring upriver using Sentinel for smaller portions, that might be something for me to keep in mind. And then 30-meter resolution being my limit on the Landsat 7 and Landsat 8. So that will keep me confined mostly for the time series analysis. For intended deliverables, the salinity index maps for the river systems, the vegetative health maps going along with them, the assorted region maps that I want to add to Esri catalog, and finally the story map going over the context, the methodology used, map results, and my assessment of the result, and if my argument for use by monitoring agencies in the area. I suppose at this time, I should say that unlike the previous presenters, Matthew and Corey, I've not actually considered conference presentations. The only presentation I have in mind at the moment is just for my workplace with the water department, since it has nothing related to the work we're doing, but it's still water related, so they're excited about it. If I wanted to present, I suppose the best organization to reach out to would be the Stimson Center in Washington, DC, which has a whole division devoted to analyzing environmental and economic issues in Southeast Asia. So checking with them would probably be the best way for me to learn, is my intended project viable for a conference, and if they have any forum for that. So as it's Q&A time, though, I'll just flash up some of the sources I've had so far. Any questions?
Great, thank you, Nicholas. Does anybody have any questions? Feel free to unmute or type into the chat.
I also am not seeing the chat come up while I'm screen sharing, so I'm just going to, oh, no, now I can. Okay, well, that's not a question.
Yeah, that's good though. I agree. Very good job. Very interesting. I hope we get some questions here.
Although, thank you very much, Brian. Have you looked at soil maps? I have. It's something I've considered doing in terms of the biggest impact in terms of concern for the agriculture in the area would be increase in soil salinity. And if there is a correlation between surface river water salinity over time, as well as the soil or the surface soil salinity. Always keeping in mind, I have to go by the surface because I can't actually do any site testing. I'm strictly, for the most part, just imagery. So I have thought about it. I think if I add that in, that would be a very important metric. I just don't know if I can do that. Yes, they are hard. in the English language, which I am restricted to. Yeah, it's just might be doing that and the 20-year time lapse of the river and vegetation might be a bit much within the time frame. You might want to consider a journal article as an option for final presentation. Interesting case. Okay. All right, I could consider that, and I'll have to think about what type of journal article that would go into. This would touch more so on an intersection of social and environmental. So I don't know, based on how I'm imagining I'd write up the final report, it would not be something that I'd find in a strictly science journal. Based on what I've read, since the science journals are more heavily involved in the methodology and less on the social context. So if you have any journal suggestion ideas, GIS and remote sensing comes to mind. Okay. All right, I'll look into that.
And one thing to consider, Nicholas and Brian, as Brian likely knows with previous advisees, we often will have students who, oh, and Doug definitely knows this because he was the advising coordinator for years and years and years, but sometimes we'll have students present just to kind of check that box for graduation because it's a little bit less time consuming sometimes than publishing and then kind of continuing on and publishing it beyond that, beyond graduation.
Okay.
So just a thought.
Very important thought. Thank you very much, Beth.
Sure. Okay.
Just a real quick question here.
Hello?
Are you going to
Oh.
be monitoring or at least trying to measure nitrate saturation within the surface water? I know it doesn't affect salinity that much, but I do know
I'm sorry,
that
can you say
Brian,
again, please?
yeah, Brian, can you say that a little bit louder?
Yeah, is that better?
I believe so, yes.
Are you going to be measuring nitrate levels within the surface water? I do know that it can affect remote sensing.
I was not planning on that. I read in the one study that there was by Li Gongfang that they were doing a analysis of water particulates, and they found more of a negative correlation between using the shortwave infrared for other particulates, but saw it had a strong correlation for examining the salinity content. So it's hopefully something that won't negatively impact the imagery analysis.
Okay. Yeah, I know
based on what I've read,
effect.
but that could be wrong since it's the one study for that so far.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
But the nitrate level would be something that is collected from the MRC's data stations. So that is something I can keep track of, even if I'm not certain I can accommodate for it.
Yeah, I'd be interested to see if there's a correlation there, or at least if you'd be able to what am I thinking of? I just had a brain fart, sorry.
Fine. Yeah. So because of the highly agricultural area there, and because chemical components are used, there is the concern for chemical runoff, as well as just leaching into the soil, but also just entering into the river systems. The Mekong Delta, they have ostensibly 3 seasons. One is just the dry season is just drier. Then they have a wet and then a very, very wet season. So they do rice. They are able to farm all year round. I'm based on what I've read, because of the dry season having the lower water levels, I don't think surface nitrate runoff from the farms, if that's, or from roads, not certain where you're thinking of other sources for increased nitrate, that should not be as high during that time. Although it might be, if I think about it, a residual effect. But it is something I can think about and make a special note on. So thank you very much for that.
Sure,
I'll have to look more into that.
Great. And if you want to go ahead and put your email address there too, in case Brian wants to follow up on that, that'd be great. Thank you, Nicholas.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Great job. Okay, so moving along, next up is Danielle Rose. Not to shame any other advisors, but the most dedicated advisor award tonight goes to Panos. His wife is in labor right now and he is here. So I don't think we've ever had that happen before. So that is some dedication. So Danielle, whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and start sharing. And we don't hear you yet, Danielle, in case you're talking. It looks like you're not muted, but is anybody else able to hear Danielle? Oh, there we go. I can hear you a little bit. Can you speak louder?
Okay. I might have to use my backup. For some reason, the microphone I was using earlier does not appear to be working.
Okay, and talk as loud as you can because you're a little bit quiet.
Okay.
Let me test it. Does this work?
Whoa, that sounds much better.
Okay, that's the original headset I was trying to use. I apologize about that.
No problem.
All right, let's get going. All right, so good evening, everyone. Sorry for the technical glitch. My name is Danielle Rose, and I'm excited to share with you my project proposal. I am going to be examining variation in migration patterns and using citizen science to study Dana's plexippus and the changing environment. Again, as stated, thank you to Panos for being here. It is amazing that you're here, considering the exciting week that you are having. So throughout the course of my presentation, I will be covering the following. I'll go into a little bit of my personal background, kind of go through the thought process and how I arrived at this topic. I'll provide a brief overview of the monarch butterfly, which is Dana's plexippus plexippus, the migratory American monarch. I'll go over how citizen science is being used in scientific literature and kind of the trends that I was seeing and how I got inspiration from those. I'll share a couple of specific papers and their methodologies that I will be applying to my own paper and describe some additional knowledge that I will need to gain in order to analyze my data similarly. I'll touch on which external environmental factor I want to bring into my analysis after I looked at the impact on some other migratory species. I'll share my current data sets that I've downloaded, share some of the limitations of those data sets as well and the timeframes that they span, as well as the number of observations. And then I'll share my methodology, largely based on an article published in Ecosphere in 2015 by Sepp and colleagues. I'll share my anticipated results, and then at the end, go over a brief project timeline. So a little bit of my background, I have an undergraduate degree in environmental science that I obtained in 2016. And in the years since, I volunteered for a number of nonprofit environmental organizations that have been involved in citizen science data collection in some capacity. So I've been on the citizen science end of it, but when you're collecting the data, oftentimes you don't get to see, the impact that that information can have on modern science. So whether it's counting harbor seals or categorizing trash at a beach cleanup, the data's there. Somebody just needs to do something with it. So that was part of my inspiration for this, is taking these observations that are on sites like eBird and iNaturalist and something like that, and using it to draw conclusions about how things are changing over time and space. So then I just had to decide on what environmental phenomenon to look at, or what species I wanted to study. So monarch butterflies floated to the top of my mind. I think this was in part due to the fact that the International Union for the Conservation of Nature listed the migratory monarch as endangered this past summer. Unfortunately, that does nothing to protect it at the federal level, but it still brings a lot of attention to the fact that there's been extreme declines over the past several decades. In addition to the recent announcement, I've also been single-handedly trying to save them myself by planting milkweed and nectar sources in my backyard. So it's of interest to me. And I had some prior knowledge of this from planning a nature festival regarding meadows and monarchs in New Jersey. So a little bit about the monarch butterfly. They're dependent on milkweed for reproduction. The adults lay their eggs on milkweed, and then it's also what the larvae consume. There's been a lot of research on native versus non-native milkweed. Non-native milkweed doesn't die off in the winter like native milkweed does. So they're actually seeing that some migratory monarchs are deciding not to migrate. They're called sedentary monarchs. So due to landscaping changes that we make in our yards or around the city, we're actually potentially modifying these long-term migratory patterns. In addition, climate change has had a big impact on that as well, with increased global temperatures. Sometimes they're not getting the instinct to migrate south towards warmer weather if it's warmer where they're at. There's been significant decreases in areas occupied by overwintering monarchs. And in addition, the IUCN reports that the Western monarch population has decreased by 99.9% since the 1980s. It's reported that there were about 10 million estimated in the 1980s, and the Western population decreased below 2,000 in 2021, although we did see a positive uptick this last year. And the Eastern migratory population also has declined by 86% between 1996 and 2014. So there's been a lot of talk about the species, but not necessarily at the migration level, just at the abundance level is what I was finding. So most of the threats to the monarch consist of loss of breeding habitat. So this is due to the sprawl of agriculture, the increased use of herbicides, as well as habitat loss due to land development. In addition, there's habitat degradation in their overwintering sites. So there's been reports of legal and illegal logging in central and northern Mexico, where the eastern population overwinters. And then, as you all know, we've been experiencing very severe weather in the past couple of years. So it's estimated that 10 million monarch butterflies actually were lost during the past couple of severe winter storms. The IUCN also lists climate change as a major factor. I'm from California, so we're constantly plagued by drought, so no water, no milkweed. In addition, the increased frequency of wildfires also just completely annihilates their habitat, both for breeding and nectar sources. So the monarch exhibits two separate migrations, which are divided by the Rocky Mountains. There's the western and the eastern. The western migration makes their way to the coastal eucalyptus groves in California, and the eastern makes their way to Mexico. And there's also a small non-migratory population in Florida, Central America, and the Caribbean, which I did not know about until I started diving deeper on this topic. It's something that I will need to take into consideration since I'm taking observation data. I'll have to actually remove those observations in order to actually focus on just the migratory population. So for those of you who have not seen overwintering, this is actually a picture taken from my hometown of Ventura, California. This is at Camino Real Park in the eucalyptus groves there. If you ever want to come see it, I'll be your tour guide and we can go out to lunch and discuss GIS. This is also a photo of the overwintering site in the OML fir tree forest in Mexico. This area is about 50 miles east of Mexico City, or west, I apologize. This is the National Park Service map showing just a basic overview of the different migrations that they take. So as you can see, there's also more complexity with the eastern migration. It takes 3 generations for them to reach their northernmost latitudes, and then the 4th generation makes their way down into Mexico. So what's not shown on this map that I will show on the next slide in a map by the Xerces Society is the non-migratory population. So here you can see the area that I will need to exclude. I'll also have to really look at any observations in Florida. So it's thought that this non-migratory subspecies, which is Danis Plexippus megalippe, has pretty much no reason to migrate just due to good weather year-round, availability of milkweed, and nectar sources. It's not known what level of interaction the subspecies has with the migratory subspecies, which is Danis Plexippus plexippus. So what I found when I was researching how to pull citizen science and do research is that most of the research being done can be grouped into 4 different categories. So they're using observational data to quantify population level patterns of movement. They're assessing how species traits influence population level movement. So that's internal factors. They're looking at how external and environmental factors influence population level movement. And they're studying movement patterns in order to inform conservation or management. So all of these are interesting, but I would like to focus on quantifying population level patterns, looking at variation in seasonal and annual migration over the years. And then I want to assess how external or environmental factors have potentially impacted that. So I want to bring in some climate data. And also, as we know, the severe storms have had a major impact. So look at weather. And also, I want to pull in some sort of change that is man-made into my analysis as well. So how citizen science is being used and what inspired me is that there's a lot of work being done with eBird data. For those of you that aren't familiar with eBird, they get over 10 million observations per year, and they report a 20% increase in observations year over year. So when I was looking at citizen science, eBird data was popping up all over the place. So it also kind of encouraged me not to use eBird data. I wanted to use a lesser known citizen science platform. It's being used to study bird migration patterns. And there's this one source by Sup and colleagues published in 2015 that I really resonated with, and I'll share more about their methods shortly. In addition, eBird data is helping us to make predictions for where rare bird species may occur. And also they've shown that it's pretty in line with the North American Breeding Bird Survey. So once I started reading more of these migratory pattern analysis papers, that's when I really narrowed in on my topic. As far as the environmental and external impact, other than climate and weather that I would like to pull into my paper, I wanted to look at a man-made impact and looking at some of the main impacts to other migratory species. I landed on wind farms. So I'm a self-proclaimed environmentalist and generally supportive of society's movement away from fossil fuels and a supporter of development of green infrastructure. But I recognize that every action we have on the planet has a reaction. And so whether it's indirect or direct impacts, birds and bats have been shown to be negatively impacted by wind turbines. There's direct death due to collision with the rotors. And then there's also barotrauma associated with it, which causes internal hemorrhaging, and it results from sudden changes in pressure. There's a lot of documented impacts. This one study that stood out to me on bats was performed in Germany, and it showed that the juveniles were found in higher quantities in the carcass individual juveniles were in higher quantity in wind farms than in the live population outside of wind farms. Was disproportionate to their number in the live population outside of the area. So it's unknown what the long-term implications of things like this will have on animal populations, but it's certainly worth noting. And so it's not just birds and bats. I found that there's a lot of evidence and ways in which they're trying to quantify how insects are negatively impacted by the rotors as well. So it's estimated that 1.2 trillion insects are killed at wind turbines in Germany each year. They're starting to try to study this more and figure out why insects are attracted. They've noted that some swarming insect colonies seem to appear frequently. They're using LiDAR to study them, and also have noted that bats are coming into wind farms to forage because of the number of insects available. So you can actually see here in photo A, there is a blade cleaning maintenance worker, and section B shows the insect detritus. This is also an issue for wind farms, as it's been shown that the insects on the rotors impact the aerodynamics of the blade as well. So at this point, I had figured out what environmental man-made data I wanted to pull in as well. When doing my literature review, I looked at several other longitudinal studies of animals and insects that were looking at migratory trends and fluctuations over time. Of those 6 most similar, 4 used linear mixed models, 1 used a Weibull distribution and simple mechanistic model, and 1 used a generalized additive model and segmented linear regression. The one that used the generalized additive model and segmented linear regression also shared their scripts publicly. Now, to be fully transparent, most of these articles and their analyses were not entirely clear to me. With my environmental science background, I only had to take 1 biostatistics course. That was almost a decade ago, and I can't say I've brushed up on it recently. So this is when it became evident that to do a similar analysis for 596B, I need to brush up on a few things and need some additional training. So for Christmas, I purchased 40 hours of Udemy courses that I am excited to start. So this is the paper that shared their results publicly. They looked at 5 migratory hummingbird species in order to look at seasonal and annual variation. They pulled data and looked at the observer effort over time and found that they had adequate data for 2008 to 2013. What they ended up doing is that they standardized the data. They converted the date to Julian day in order for the script to be able to process it effectively. They pulled the observations into equal area hexagonal cells in an icosahedron map of North America. So they were able to summarize the observations in each hexagon over time and model the summarize the observations and then plot them over time using a generalized additive model. And then they performed a segmented linear regression in order to determine the onset of the spring migration and the start of the autumn migration as well. And they were able to use these models to predict the date of when they reach their highest latitude. So I want to pull this in and look and see as there's been these massive declines in the population over time, if we're seeing that they are migrating differently, arriving at different latitudes later. And then I also want to be able to see if the presence of additional wind turbines throughout time has caused it to take them potentially longer to reach their spring habitat or their breeding grounds or the higher latitude areas. So here are the supplemental materials that the study shared. They have the R scripts with the relevant functions for executing it. And then they also did an additional analysis looking at some bird band data from the breeding bird laboratory in order to try to see if they could perform any spatial analyses Unfortunately, they were not able to actually perform analyses, but it was an informative appendix. So I'm hoping that using Monarch recapture data, I can do the same as well. So pulling in the wind turbine data, I will be using a linear mixed model. So as I mentioned, I found 4 different studies using these models. One studying migratory caribou, pulled in local weather, broad climate variables, and they were looking to see if these external factors impacted the departure or arrival date. So I want to do the same thing with my Monarch observations. They used GPS collar data, but I will be relying on my citizen science data. As far as my project data sources, I've got 2 different citizen science platforms that I was able to get data from. One is called Journey North, and they have observations from 1997 through present. There's varying observer effort over the years, and although it's called Journey North, I can assure you they also have observations of the journey south to the overwintering grounds. They've got 2 separate downloads per year, one for the spring, which they define as January through the end of July, and one for the winter, which they define as the beginning of August through the end of the calendar year. So Journey North is a lot more simple compared to other sources such as iNaturalist. The metadata and attribute fields associated with the observations, there's not much to it. It's just lat long, sometimes just a zip code. It's not standardized over the years. It's changed through time. So I'm going to have to do a lot of data cleanup in order to get it into my analysis. So this is a look at the observations over time that I have to work with. As you can see, the 90s and earlier 2000s were not very substantial. However, since 2010, there's been over 3,000 observations reported each year. You can also see that the fall observations are more frequent. That's actually when they're doing the journey south. So I thought it was a little bit ironic that they're called the journey north. My data from iNaturalist, I have 1994 through current. Again, there's varying observer effort over the years, which I'll have to take into consideration. iNaturalist has tons of additional data. I'll have to determine whether I can be picky with my data and look at just the research grade material and the verified data. There was more iNaturalist data in the more recent years when compared to the Journey North. So as you can see, iNaturalist didn't really have a large number of monarch observations until about 2014. Then they exceed 1,000 each year. I found a third data source called eButterfly. In their database, they have over 22,000 monarch observations ranging from 1885 to present. This includes entries made by museums. However, when I went to go export it, I found that they don't have that capability yet. So I'm hoping by the time that I take the project class that I will be able to export it. If not, I'm going to be making some phone calls. So overall, this is what I'm working with. This is combined Journey North data and iNaturalist over time. As you can see in 2018, iNaturalist observations outweigh the Journey North observations. And I'll have to go in January and get the cumulative 2022 observations. In addition, there's some tagged recovery data of monarchs. This is from a site called Monarch Watch, and they have data from 1993 to 2021. These recoveries are from both central Mexico and US and Canada. So I'll have to see if there's enough data here to work with. At minimum, I'll be able to provide an interesting appendix. So for reference, this is the appendix that the hummingbird paper that I found was able to provide. So again, they looked at 5 different migratory hummingbirds. I'll just be looking at one butterfly, but they're able to look at the number of recoveries. And what I'll also be able to see in mine is recoveries for both Eastern and Western. So that will be interesting to see if there's a variation in the data there. As far as some of the considerations with the data I've collected, I'll have to look at the observer effort over time and eliminate years with inadequate data. I'll also have to consider the fact that there might be duplicate entries across data sets. So if there's a really dedicated citizen scientist, perhaps they have entered their observation into multiple data sources. So I'll have to look at that closely. I'll also have to recognize that non-migratory population in Florida and exclude those observations and kind of figure out the cutoff where to exclude within the state, do some additional research. And then I'll have to recognize that I'm combining data sets and I need to take careful consideration not to skew the analysis with one data set. So ultimately, I'll probably have to perform the analyses separately and then combine them to make sure that I'm obtaining the same or similar results. I've also got USGS wind turbine data. It is data that shows development through time because they have a field, which is the production year. So I'll have to use that as a proxy for the year that it was constructed. I'll be able to paint a picture of the past and look at wind turbines going to production. I've got data from 1981 through current. So the goals of my project are to examine variation and migration patterns. I'm hoping to show that throughout time, they've arrived at different latitudes at different time of the year. I'm hoping to look at my tagged recapture data to see if there's any patterns that exist and use that additional script from the Hummingbird paper. And then I want to perform the linear mixed model in order to see if wind energy development appears to have any impact on migration and the timing of it. So as stated, those are the three main components. I'll be pulling in the generalized additive model, segmented linear regressions, and then also doing the recaptured data analysis as well. So first I need to standardize my monarch observations. I need to pull out the USGS wind turbine data by year. And my main focus for now is learning RStudio, the 40 hours. Then I just need to plug in my data. The Hummingbird paper, Sepp and colleagues, they provided a brief overview of the way that they formatted their observational data. So I will need to mimic that to pull them into the scripts, examine my results, and write my manuscript. I'm hoping to view fluctuations over time. I might not be able to answer why with my project, but I'm hoping that what I am able to show or not show will raise more questions and it will encourage more people to study the species more closely. So overall, these are the graphs that I will be reproducing with the monarch data. So as you can see, they're able to plot when the models showed spring migration starting from 2008 to 2013, when they reached peak latitude, and when the end of autumn migration occurred. And then the maps on the left and the graphs there are also informative and are able to show when they reached peak latitude and trends in their migration. The value of this presentation is bringing awareness of how citizen science can have a meaningful impact on modern science. It'll stress the importance of citizen science and inspire people to potentially participate. And hopefully by visualizing changes over several years, using the most recently available data, it will help others to answer the question of why variation exists. For my timeline, I've already downloaded RStudio, signed up for my RStudio courses, and then also downloaded all observation data sets. My next tasks going into next year will be to finalize my Udemy training, quality check my data, format it in the way that the Hummingbird paper has specified. Then later into spring, I'll look at my wind turbine data and start spring 2, implement my scripts, and then finalize my manuscript. And that's my project plan. Are there any questions?
Great job, Danielle. So interesting, and what beautiful pictures. Does anybody have any questions? Feel free to unmute if you want to ask out loud. I don't know if you can see the chat yet, Danielle, but there is a question.
No, I have not looked at the change detection tools, but if you could lead me in the right direction, then maybe I can incorporate those as well.
You said you're doing just the wind turbines? Because I saw something about how they're starting to plant more flowers on the solar panel fields to attract more bees and butterflies.
Yeah, I read about that as well. I kind of just narrowed in on the wind turbines, but I wanted I have a GIS file of solar farm locations as well. I just was kind of trying to narrow in on one thing, but it would be interesting to see
And
if that causes any changes or attraction.
Nice.
But that's interesting.
And have you been to the butterfly sanctuary in San Juan Capistrano?
Sorry, can you say that one more time?
I said, have you been to the butterfly sanctuary in San Juan Capistrano? It's right behind the mission.
I have not. No,
It's
I have been
awesome.
up to Monterey up there. I know that they've got an area that you can walk about, and I've been up to Pismo, but I haven't been to San Juan. I will add it to my list.
The train stops right there too, so it's if you just take the train, it's quicker.
Yeah, I'm hoping. I've had a pretty good experience with the Udemy courses, so I'm thinking that the ones I've selected will give me a good background knowledge in order to fully understand the scripts and what I'm performing. And plus that it will be beneficial just to know for my own personal use and professional use in the future.
I'll ask a quick question in case anybody else is typing a question. How difficult is it, or what is the process for the overlapping data that you mentioned? You know, the sort of having a lot of different citizen science data that might be duplicates.
How likely is it, or what?
No, how difficult is it to sort of weed that out?
So I would probably start by sorting it by date, and maybe symbolize it by month, and then actually convert it into shapefile. I think it would be easier to see. I'm a very visual person, so being able to map it out and then look closer at the data is probably how I would handle it. But yeah, I'm sure I could probably come up with a function in Excel to, if the coordinates are close enough, I could maybe flag it, something like that.
Great. Any other questions? And like everybody else, Danielle, if you can stick your email address in there in case anybody has some follow-ups.
Oh, sure, will do.
Okay, great job. Okay, so the final presentation tonight is Elena Shubin. So Elena, whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and start sharing.
Okay, hi everyone. Let's see.
Hello.
You guys can see that?
Yep.
All right, so I decided for my capstone to look at the effects of contrails on surface diurnal temperature variations in the Pacific Northwest. I'm working with Dr. Gio Cervone, and then Andrew Carlton is also helping us as well. So for the background, these contrails are cirrus clouds formed by jet planes. We have some conditions for formation, and these are really just factors that make it more likely for contrails to appear, or maybe factors that would make them last a little bit longer in the sky, but all of these aren't exactly necessary. So we want planes flying at 8 to 13 kilometers altitude, temperatures below 233 Kelvin, relative humidity of about 80% or more, and then the presence of soot particles in the exhaust will also help those clouds form. And then we have this little table to the right that gives a little bit more detail on more of the conditions for formation. And then there's certain types of contrails depending on their shape and their duration. And then, other studies have found that contrails have an insulating effect, as most clouds do. So they'll decrease daytime surface temperatures and increase nighttime surface temperatures. But beyond the surface temperatures, the temperature in the atmosphere below the contrails is affected as well, not just the surface, but that data is much less accessible. So I won't be looking at that, unfortunately. And so then SeaTac Airport is my local airport. It's a high traffic airport in Tacoma, Washington. So it's 14 miles south of Seattle. It's very busy, 50 million passengers a year, 1,200 flights a day. And so we found that contrails with significant impact on surface temperatures will be visible in satellite imagery. But because of the cloud cover in my area, we're only going to look at imagery from the summer months when it's mostly pretty clear. Obviously, like in the fall, winter, spring in Seattle, it's pretty bad weather, it rains all the time. So then the study area will be, we decided within a 50-kilometer radius of SeaTac, but we expect that it's going to be shaped more like a donut because we're not going to see contrails at takeoff or landing usually. And then, right, so we'll compare surface temperature variations of day and night with and without contrail formation conditions. So so other studies have found that it's likely that contrails do impact these temperature variations, but these effects have been researched on the East Coast and the Midwest, but not so much in my area in the Pacific Northwest. So just looking at SeaTac as my local airport, we were kind of curious to see how the local climate is affected by contrail formation. And then also just kind of curious to look at the impacts of variation or aviation on climate change beyond just CO2 emissions, which is obviously really well documented already. So we'll start with data from MODIS, which we'll access through the Worldview Earth Data website. And I have some imagery from there on another slide in a second. So using this imagery, the project will first identify the presence or absence of contrails for these days in the summer that we choose. And then we'll analyze and compare the diurnal, so daytime and nighttime surface temperatures on days with clouds and without to see if we can notice a pattern of maybe like an insulating effect as we've seen in other areas. So then we'll look over land and water. We're going to pick a diverse set of locations within the study area to make comparisons. We haven't done that yet, but we'd like to look maybe, of course, land, water, somewhere in the mountains, somewhere where there's a lot of snow cover usually, in a forested area, etc. And so then for my timeline, in January and February, we're going to be kind of shopping for data, downloading it, preparing it for analysis. And then later on in the spring, we'll start analyzing the data for the presence of contrails and looking at the surface temperatures. Towards the end of spring and early summer, May, June, we'll start to summarize the results and prepare the presentation. And then we're looking at presenting the results at the ESRI user conference, which is mid-July. And then, so this is some of that MODIS imagery, and you can see a contrail, which is just southwest of Portland, and this was taken on July 21st of this year. Okay, and so for the presentation value, we know that aircraft-induced cloudiness is contributing to anthropogenic radiative forcing. So just looking at these little pie charts, we can see that aviation makes up a small portion of radiative forcing caused by human activity. Maybe it's only about 5% there, but more than half of the aviation-derived radiative forcing is aircraft-induced cloudiness. So even maybe more than CO2 emissions possibly. And then we found that aircraft-induced cloudiness radiative forcing is comprised of the contrail cirrus, so that's about 3/4 of the impact. And then the persistent contrails are the ones that last longer than 10 minutes, hold their shape longer than 10 minutes, and that's about 1/4 of the impacts. And so by making small adjustments, it's possible to significantly decrease the impact of the contrails. So these adjustments could be either reducing flights when the conditions for formation are met, or rerouting flights to areas where, or away from areas where contrails have greater impact. So maybe not flying over like glaciated areas, for example, where that insulating effect would be much more disastrous than over some kind of like plains or somewhere where the temperature's a little more mild. And then it could also affect the design of an airplane. So we could design a plane that minimizes contrails, maybe by, for example, capturing soot particles and the emissions. So we anticipate the results we anticipate, definitely we anticipate that contrails will have an insulating effect in the Pacific Northwest area, just as they do on the East Coast and in the Midwest. We expect that the impact will be the greatest in the summer months because that's when the conditions are best met for formation, but also there's less cloud cover overall. So when skies are already cloudy, contrails may form, but their impact on radiative forcing is pretty negligible just because there's probably bigger clouds that are doing more insulating. And then we're also thinking that the effects may be mitigated by the presence of water. And then here's my sources. Sorry, that was so fast. I'm actually in India right now. It's really early in the morning, so just doing my best here. But yeah, if there's any questions, let me know.
Thanks, Elena. Does anybody have any questions? There's a question there from Brooke.
Yeah, yes, Rick. So we're looking close to airports. The center of the study area is going to be SeaTac Airport, which is Seattle Tacoma's airport. And then we're going to look at a 500-kilometer radius from that central point. Thank you, Jeremy.
Yeah, Elena, I had a question.
Sure, yeah.
So, having been in and out of SeaTac a few times, how do you mitigate the CO2 from all the cars and the traffic that's in there from the contrail heat? Like everything's producing heat around that airport. Do you have a way to mitigate that?
Yeah, sure. That's a good question. So like I said, we're going to choose specific locations for these comparisons. So we probably won't be choosing a point that's right at the airport, or maybe a point like in downtown Seattle where there's a lot of car traffic, just because we wouldn't expect to see contrails forming right by the airport either. You have to hit a certain altitude before you would see those.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you did say that.
Yeah, if that answers your question. And then Gito asked me to iterate again what satellite products I'll be using. So that'll be the MODIS satellite imagery.
I was just curious, Elena, have you submitted the abstract to the conference yet?
No, not yet.
Okay, I saw that they are having they might have just extended the deadline, but it's definitely coming up.
Oh, okay, good to know. Yeah, we were thinking there may be a conference that might be a better fit for this project, but we just haven't finalized that yet.
Okay, yeah, you might want to see if submit something for that, and then yeah, and then if you find another one, then you can just not do that one, I guess. It's one of the ones that's has such an early submission deadline, so it's always kind of hard to catch.
Good to know. Thank you for saying that.
Yep. Okay, well, since it's so early in the morning for you,
oh my gosh,
we will let you go. Why don't you go ahead and put your email address in the chat, and maybe some folks have some follow-up questions for you. But yeah, great job. thanks to everybody for being here tonight. Quite a few presentations. We have our next round tomorrow, starting at noon Eastern. There will be 4 tomorrow, and then there will be 5 on Monday. So if you can come, please join the next couple. As soon as this recording is processed, I will stick it into the Capstone Library. Just a reminder, you do need to log into there to be able to see that in case you get an error. But yeah, thanks to everybody. I will put the link to the peer review presentation here in the chat again in a minute, and have a good night.